Order. Daniel Kawczynski to move the motion.
For Polish contribution during the Second World War, Mr. Pritchard, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of the summer of 1939 was designed to annihilate and destroy Poland and the Polish nation.
Order. Sorry, Mr. Kawczynski, can I just encourage the public gallery not to take photographs? It is not permitted in Westminster Hall. Thank you. Daniel Kawczynski.
Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as I said, was designed to destroy and annihilate the Poles. And a few weeks later, after this treaty between the Germans and Russians was signed, we saw the brutal invasion of Poland by German forces on September the 1st, 1939. Despite so much subjugation, despite the fact of so many Polish cities being destroyed and so many Poles being imprisoned, and the tyranny of what was imposed on Poland in 1939 and thereafter, Poles themselves refused to be subjugated. They share our values of freedom and determined to be free people. They came in unprecedented numbers from Poland to join up with British forces to fight with their British counterparts in 1939 and 1940. And of course, the Polish government in exile came to be based here in London, and thanks to the hospitality and generosity of the British government, the Polish government in exile actually operated in London until 1989, with the fall of communism in Poland, and when a democratic and legitimate government was finally restored to Poland. And of course, the most important battle that they participated in was the Battle of Britain itself. And today I had the great honour of speaking again to Lord Tebbit in the other House about his views about the Battle of Britain. And one of the most enjoyable things that I've done in the last 14 years as a Member of Parliament was to join Lord Tebbit at the RAF Club for an Anglo-Polish dinner, where Lord Tebbit was the guest speaker. And he said something which has really resonated with me and which I will always remember, and I wanted to share with you today. According to Lord Tebbit, the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe were so evenly matched in the summer of 1940 that the British side was beginning to lose that battle. Those are the words of Lord Tebbit, not my own. So evenly matched were they. And in fact, what he said is that to replace the planes was relatively easy. Carry on production with armaments factories and creating these planes was fine. But to replace the pilots was extremely difficult. We all know how long it takes to train a pilot, and it was very difficult to replace all the losses. And according to Lord Tebbit, it was the Poles coming in such unprecedented numbers to join the British forces in the summer of 1940 that tipped the balance to the British side. And I have to say that last year there were two wonderful films that were released here in the United Kingdom. One of them is called the Hurricane Movie. The other one is called the 303 Squadron. And I've spoken about these films to colleagues who have then gone on to watch these films. And I very much urge you, Mr. Pritchard, as my Shropshire neighbour, if you have the opportunity of watching one of these films. But of course, it's a modern-day account sharing with the next generation and new, younger generations about the extraordinary heroism, courage, and determination of these Polish pilots to fight in the Battle of Britain. And of course, the Polish 303 Squadron shot down more enemy aircraft than any other squadron in the Battle of Britain. It is the most famous squadron, but it was one of 16 Polish squadrons embedded within the RAF. And we talk about Poles coming to this country. Of course, there are now 1 million Poles in the United Kingdom, and we benefit enormously from their contribution to our country. I have heard in the past people talking about Poles coming to live and work here and us being so dependent on Polish plumbers and other Polish professions, but we were so dependent on these Poles, these highly skilled, brave, courageous Poles when they came. And just as an example of that, I met with the new editor of the Shrewsbury Chronicle, which you will know, Mr. Pritchard, is the main newspaper in my constituency. And Mr. Burakowski, the editor of the Shrewsbury Chronicle, when I met him last week, was telling me about his father's experiences. He was one of those Poles who had come over during the Second World War and was part of a bombing squadron. The Poles were also led out of captivity in the Soviet Union by the famous General Anders. We have invited his daughter, Senator Anna Maria Anders, on many occasions to address the Polish diaspora here in the House of Commons. But General Anders brought many Polish soldiers from captivity in the Soviet Union through Iran and joined up with the British forces in Palestine, where they were equipped and trained before they joined the British 8th Army. I've had the opportunity of visiting British and Polish graves in Libya before the revolution and seeing these cemeteries side by side in Tripoli, but also in Tobruk. And what was so poignant for me when I visited these cemeteries is just how young these boys were. In certain cases, 19, 20, 21. They were fighting side by side, British and Poles, in the desert, in Libya, hundreds of miles from their homes, in a desert terrain, so young, so much ahead of them, the opportunity to have children perhaps one day themselves, the opportunity to have a full and successful life, and yet at the age of 19 or 20, they gave up their lives together, sacrificed their lives in order to fight fascism and the tyranny of fascism. That's why we remember them today, and that's why we remember their sacrifices. Yes, of course.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. We have a Polish community in Coventry, but I hope the honourable gentleman will talk about Polish heroism at Monte Cassino, for example, because that was quite a battle, and the casualties were very high amongst Polish troops.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I will come on to the Monte Cassino shortly. But talking about North Africa, I have to say that anybody, Mr. Pritchard, who has studied the Battle of El Alamein, which, as you will know, was the turning point in the whole North African campaign, anybody who has studied maps of El Alamein, that battlefront, and the topography of the terrain of El Alamein, will realize the extraordinary importance that landmines played in that operation. And I have to say to you, it was a Pole, Joseph Kosacki, who invented the mine detector. And that mine detector was used successfully for the first time in 1941 in El Alamein, which of course was, as I've said, the turning point in the North African campaign. Can you imagine, Mr. Pritchard, if we had lost in Alamein? And can you imagine, and the forces between the Allies and the Axis powers were very finely balanced at that juncture in 1941. Can you imagine if we had lost and if Rommel's forces had managed to push forward beyond Egypt to take the oil fields of the Middle East? Again, I think the events unfolding in the Second World War may have been very, very different. So we celebrate the contribution of Joseph Kosacki, a great Pole who died in 1990 for his contribution in inventing the mine detector. The honourable gentleman referred to Monte Cassino, and once the Polish and British forces had gone through from El Alamein, through Tobruk, retaken Benghazi and Tripoli, through Tunisia, they came up through Sicily and the spine of Italy, finally reaching the Gustav Line. And the Gustav Line was the strongest fortified, highly elevated defences along the spine of Italy, which were perceived to be impregnable. And the most difficult part of the Gustav Line was Monte Cassino itself. On the 18th of May 1944, at 9:45 a.m., a patrol of the 12th Podolski Lancers Regiment reached the ruins of Monte Cassino, and they put there a Polish flag, followed very shortly by a British flag. I watched today, it's very easy to talk about some of these sacrifices and statistics, Mr. Pritchard, but today in my House of Commons office I watched a YouTube video of the battle in Monte Cassino, the hand-to-hand combat, throwing grenades at each other and being fired upon all the time. It was perceived to be one of the most bloodiest and difficult battles on the whole of the Western Front during the Second World War. And just during Monte Cassino, the Poles lost 923 men died, 2,931 were injured, and 345 were reported missing. It is in the lexicon of the whole of the Polish narrative. Monte Cassino is something that all Poles have very close to their heart. And I better stop talking about it, otherwise I'll start to well up. But a song was created, which is called The Red Poppies on Monte Cassino, to symbolize the extraordinary amount of blood that was spilt by Polish soldiers in reaching the top in order to liberate it. Of course, we are not allowed to speak in foreign languages, Mr. Pritchard, but it's called Czerwone Maki na Monte Cassino, which translates as the red poppies on Monte Cassino. Yes, I give way.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend and neighbour for giving way and for his wonderful speech. I wonder if he's also had the opportunity to visit the National Memorial Arboretum in my own county of Staffordshire, where a statue of a Polish soldier from Monte Cassino is there, along with 3 other statues of Polish servicemen. This was unveiled about 10 years ago in a fitting memorial to the huge contribution made by Polish forces during the Second World War.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend and near neighbour for raising that. Of course, and having these Westminster Hall debates, as we are doing now, throws up all of this very interesting information about the Arboretum in his constituency, and I very much hope that encourage members of the public who are watching this on television throughout our country to actually take advantage of coming to his constituency or nearby in Lichfield to look at this wonderful Arboretum and memorial. General Anders, who led the Polish forces in Monte Cassino, said this: 22 days under constant fire in terrible conditions, 7 days of fierce struggle to break German defences. It was not just a battle of Cassino, it was the battle for Poland. And that was from his book, Without Last Chapter. We recently saw on television the commemoration of the D-Day landings, Mr. Pritchard, and our own Prime Minister joined Mr. Morawiecki, the Polish Prime Minister, on the 75th anniversary of those important landings. D-Day, 1944, of course, the start of the liberation of the whole of the continent of Europe. And again, the Poles, the month before, just recently, fighting in Monte Cassino, were also there at D-Day. Polish airmen took part in protecting the convoys of soldiers that were moving towards Normandy, and Polish ships took part in Operation Neptune, the naval operation, which was part of the D-Day landings. The Polish 1st Armoured Division, attached to the British and Canadian forces, landed later in the campaign and took part in fighting around the Falaise pocket. Of course.
I thank him for giving way. Would he add to that list of Polish contributions to the Second World War 3 mathematicians whose work helped to make Enigma possible, which ended the war at least 2 years earlier?
Yes. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I have a little section on that a little bit later on in my speech. Finally, Operation Market Garden, where the Allies tried to shorten the war by landing in the Netherlands. Polish paratroopers took part in unprecedented numbers with their British counterparts in Operation Market Garden. And again, I have had the opportunity of visiting the Polish and British cemeteries in the Netherlands, and of course we see the same recurring theme. It is the sheer youth of these young men who together gave up their lives so that we can have freedom. My honourable friend has mentioned Bletchley Park, and of course he is absolutely right. Polish mathematicians and code breakers came over from Poland, and Sir Dermot Turing, relative of Alan Turing, in his book, The Real Story of How Enigma Was Broken, has highlighted the unique contribution, the outstanding and overwhelming contribution of Polish mathematicians and cryptographers that broke those Enigma codes. And I can't begin to explain the importance of this, as my honourable friend has already alluded to. By breaking the codes, giving us the opportunity of understanding where German positions and movements were going to be forthcoming, allowed us to shorten the war, some say by at least 2 years, therefore potentially saving hundreds of thousands, if not perhaps millions of lives. But there are 3 gentlemen who I'd like to refer to put on the record. Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rozycki, and Henryk Żygalski. And somebody who was originally born in Poland, even I have difficulty pronouncing those surnames, and I dread to think what the people in Hansard are going to do with them, but I hope I pronounce them correctly. Mr. Pritchard, we also had recently, we have donated books to the House of Commons Library, and there's been an exhibition here in the House of Commons just 2 weeks ago about a lady called Krystyna Skarbek, or Granville. She was apparently, according to legend, Winston Churchill's favourite spy. And she was a young Polish lady who was dropped behind enemy lines on many occasions and very instrumental in reconnaissance and helping to ensure that sabotage against German forces was coordinated in an effective way. Despite all of those contributions, and I think my honourable friends and honourable members will acknowledge that Poland made those extraordinary contributions, the Clement Attlee government refused to allow Polish soldiers to take part in the victory parade on the 8th of June 1946 for fear of offending Joseph Stalin. This dictator had already by that stage managed to impose a brutal, tyrannical, communist puppet regime in Poland, but for fear of upsetting him, we in this country decided to exclude the Polish forces from that victory parade on the 8th of June 1946. I give way.
Giving way and congratulate him on securing the debate and the tremendous speech that he's giving. And in Suffolk, we're aware of the contribution that the Polish Air Force made to supporting the war effort from Norfolk and Suffolk during the war. But on that point, I mean, he makes a very good point about the failure of the Attlee government to recognise the contribution of the Polish community and the Polish Army and Air Force in the war. How would he suggest, as we come to 75 years on from VE Day next year, we could help to put right that wrong and to better recognise the Polish contribution to the war effort?
Well, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend for raising that point, and I want to take the opportunity of saying that, you know, as a fluent Polish speaker, well, or attempting to be fluent, very difficult language, I have to say, when you go to Poland and you speak to them in English, they say something quite different to you than when you go and talk to them in Polish. And this is still a real... They're very friendly towards the British, they love the British, they want to work with the British, but this is still a source of real pain for the Poles. And I think that he's touching upon a very, very important issue. How do we now repair what happened in 1946? And how do we work with the Polish diaspora here in the United Kingdom to ensure that the Polish community themselves, that we engage with the Polish diaspora here in our country to make sure that we do create a new monument or do something to ensure that that unique contribution is highlighted. We have a Polish War Memorial in Northolt, but can we do something in addition to that, in the run-up to many anniversaries, to yet again celebrate the contribution of Poles and educate the younger generations about their unique contribution? I give way, of course, to my fellow half Pole from the Labour Party.
I say dziękuję for giving way to me. And as the honourable gentleman knows, my paternal grandfather was Polish. He served in the Polish Merchant Navy, and that is what actually brought him here to the UK. And I'd love to work with him on creating a lasting memorial to all those Poles who contributed so much. And the final thing I'd like to say is my grandfather, Mieczysław Bagnicki, he was Polish to his fingertips, and he was very proud of that. But equally, he thought the UK had given him a wonderful life. He brought his children up here, it gave him a career, and he was incredibly grateful for everything that Britain and the Queen had done for him. And so I think the concept of a lasting memorial would be very appropriate indeed. And I thank him for that.
He gave us you.
Well, I'd like to thank the Honourable Lady for that contribution, and what I would say to her is we Poles have to stick together. And I would be delighted to work with her and anybody else who is cognizant of the unique contribution of Poles to our country and also wants to demonstrate to the 1 million Poles living in the United Kingdom that we value them today, that we cherish their contribution to our country, and that we are determined to work together to remember these things, even in the modern age. We may be leaving the European Union, but we're not leaving Europe. And it's very, very important to remember that Poland will continue to be a very important ally for us in NATO. I'm coming up to wrapping up, Mr. Pritchard, but I'd like to say one thing. And I gave a book to the... Of course I give way.
He's done an excellent job in detailing the contribution made across the services, of course, every year of the war. And I think that that's right, and that often isn't appreciated. It certainly is appreciated in my constituency, which, of course, houses the Polish social and cultural organisation, the POSC, which all members are very welcome. But I thought he was a little bit sectarian in talking about the Attlee government. I'm sure he would also like to pay tribute to that government for passing the Polish Resettlement Act in 1947, which was effectively the first mass migration act and enabling citizenship for about 200,000 Poles who'd fought in that wartime generation.
Yes, I very much acknowledge that, and I can assure the honourable gentleman I wasn't trying to make a party political point on that, I deliberately didn't say Labour government, I said the Attlee government, but I acknowledge his point about some of the subsequent achievements of that government in protecting the rights of the Polish people to remain and settle here in the United Kingdom. The first thing I gave to Jonathan Nott, the current British ambassador to Warsaw, when he came to visit us, was a copy of a book outlining Operation Unthinkable. These were Churchill's plans, basically the unthinkable, which was to carry on and liberate, go beyond Berlin and to liberate Warsaw. Of course, we had declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939 because of our treaty obligations to Poland. The Poles were sad and concerned that a second front against Germany was not possible in 1939, early 1940, by the French and the British. And of course, the Poles at that juncture were left to defend themselves. On one side fighting the Germans, on the other side fighting the Russians. But Churchill, towards the end of the war, wanted to promote these plans to liberate Warsaw, but unfortunately those plans were thwarted by Roosevelt and Stalin and others. And Poland was then subjugated to 50 years of brutal, tyrannical communist regime. And I believe I'm the only Conservative MP who was born in a communist country. So I know what communism is, I know how it looks like and how it feels like. I used to go back to see my beloved grandfather, Roman Kawczynski, every year under communism, and what our fellow Europeans went through being subjugated to this politically Orwellian and economically illiterate system is beyond comprehension. And that is one of the reasons why they have needed help in the post-communist era to rebuild their country and their industries and their infrastructure, simply because of the appalling impact that communism had on their country. Of course.
At the beginning of his speech, he referred to the terrible pact between Hitler and Stalin that paved the way for the Second World War. I think he also ought to make some reference to the fact that when the underground army rose up in 1944 and we wished to supply them with airdrops, munitions, the Russians refused to allow our transport aircraft to operate from their bases so as to help support the Poles in that uprising. And whilst I know he is mainly concerned with the Polish contribution to the effort in Britain, we should not also forget those people in Poland who saved the remnants of families like mine from extermination by hiding Jewish people at the risk of their own lives.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend, and I have to say to him that when we take regular delegations of British MPs, as the chairman of the All-Party Group for Poland, and by the way, if there's anybody here who hasn't joined the All-Party Group for Poland, you better do so, or I very much hope to invite you to join. I think we now have 62 members of Parliament, making us one of the larger all-party groups. When we take regular delegations to Poland, we actually have seen a memorial in Warsaw where one of those British planes crashed in a park whilst trying to supply food and weapons to the underground fighters in the Warsaw Uprising, who were taking on the Germans in the summer of 1944, whilst the Russians stayed on the other side of the river, allowing the slaughter to take place on an unprecedented scale. So we laid flowers, I'd like him to know, at the monument in the park where the British plane crashed. And of course he is absolutely right. Stalin refused to allow the British planes flying from Italy, I think Ancona or somewhere on the coast there, all the way to Warsaw, so they had to fly all the way there, drop the equipment and fly back. And I also pay tribute to his reference to the sacrifices of Poles in helping their Jewish friends and neighbours during the Second World War. Members of my family were shot by the Germans for hiding Jews on our estate in Western Poland. And Poland was the only country in occupied Europe where there was the death penalty for helping Jewish people. So people knew exactly what they were doing when they were hiding and protecting Jews. In my family's case, they made my relative watch as they shot his 12-year-old daughter first, then they shot his wife, then they shot him. And his crime was hiding Jewish friends and neighbours. So this is something we will never forget, and we will always pass on to our children and the next generation. And finally, Mr. Pritchard, the alliance with Poland today is very, very strong. We now have 1 million Poles living and working, contributing to our country, and in the post-Brexit world, their rights will be guaranteed to stay in our country, and they will continue to make a vast contribution to our island. And we are not going to put sea mines in the English Channel and barbed wire on the cliffs of Dover. We will continue to welcome highly skilled, highly educated Polish workers to our country with the new immigration work permits that will be afforded. And when we do go to Poland, Mr. Pritchard, we meet with soldiers who are on a rotational basis in northeast Poland. We already have 150 British soldiers in the Suwałki Gap, and I very much hope it's a prelude to a permanent NATO base or maybe even a permanent British base in eastern Poland. The Americans are already talking to their Polish counterparts about an American base in Poland, and I very much hope that we will follow suit. I received a letter from the British Legion. I'm not sure whether representatives have managed to come here today, but they have sent me a two-page letter outlining what the British Legion are doing through their campaign Remember Together, to engage with the Polish community up and down our country and collectively with their British counterparts remember the tremendous courage and dignity of both British and Polish pilots. As the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament, Mr. Pritchard, I take great pride in the contribution of Poles to this country, not only in the Battle of Britain, but subsequently. And I very much hope that we will continue to work with this key strategic European partner in many years to come to forge ever closer, stronger military and economic links. Thank you.